sponsored by the Women's Major Group and Global Policy Forum and the Campaign of Campaigns. And let me say immediately, there is interpretation available in French and Spanish. And for those looking for English, there is, you click the globe at the bottom of the screen. And for all of us to benefit from hearing this, let me turn to our interpreters to fully explain other instructions.
Bonjour. Pour l'interprétation en français, vous pouvez cliquer sur le petit globe en bas de votre écran à droite qui dit interprétation et choisir la langue que vous souhaitez écouter, donc en l'occurrence le français. Bonne conférence.
Merci.
Buenos días. Para activar la interpretación en su computador, abajo a mano derecha, haga clic en el globo que dice interpretación y escoja el idioma que prefiere. Le recomendamos que silencie el audio original. Si está en su teléfono, en la pantalla de Zoom, cuando la toca, hay 3 puntos abajo a mano derecha que dice más o more. Cuando toca los puntos, elige interpretación de idiomas o language interpretation, elige el idioma que prefiere y después presiona arriba a la mano derecha terminado. Las instrucciones también están en el chat. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you may already be aware from what you've seen and heard, there is a tremendous team of feminists hiding behind the scenes for this event. I don't actually know what it means to say behind the scenes on Zoom. I suppose in one way we're all a bit behind the scenes. But let me say as well that please use the chat as well. It is here for you to talk not only to us, but to each other. This is a pretty provocative topic, and we anticipate a lively session, both in the presentations and in the chat. So get fully engaged. So why the focus on multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism? Because I think for many of us here, we've been working for many, many years in the sphere of multilateralism. And we used to bemoan, basically, the implementation gap in achieving the declarations achieved, for example, in Beijing, in developing the programs of action and holding governments accountable to those agreements. But I think we would all agree that the COVID and climate crises, in addition to many other pre-existing conditions, have made it impossible to ignore that we're also confronting a governance failure. A gap, yes, but a gap of equality and fairness in global rules, as well as in national ones. And if you've been listening to some of the statements by the heads of state and government at the GA in the last while, we're hearing increasingly articulated the problem about a trust gap. The gap of trust and confidence in both public and private sectors. And repeatedly that multilateralism is in crisis. This was the subject of a big debate last year in the GA and the outcome of a declaration with many pledged changes in there. But one of the challenges we face is how do you change the outcomes using the same decision-making processes that themselves are riddled with power asymmetries, that are distanced from so many, and are not accountable to human rights and environmental treaties. And I think it's this dilemma that has contributed to bringing a lot of people to advocate for multi-stakeholderism. For many, this is seen as a way to be more people-centered, to bring in new and excluded voices, and to bring in all sectors of society, public and private, that need to be involved in addressing challenges and global threats. We also hear a lot more frequently now about structural barriers, about weak institutions, and how these also are very manifest, the reality of them across borders. So no one is safe until we are all safe. And with this comes the appeal again to a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. We are all in this together. And sometimes we even hear that systems change will only come about with the collaboration of everyone. But again, we have the same problem of something being missing. The acknowledgement, we might all be in it together, but there's common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. This kind of an approach often skirts over the power imbalances, not only in causing the threats or exacerbating the threats we face, but also in impacting and distorting the attempts to correct them. So the responses of all hands on deck so far is a response not rooted in rights. The solutions rely on persuasion, they rely on incentives, they rely on leveraging as much, if not more than on legislation, regulation, and ensuring a robust public sector that is essential for the full range of rights. And today's panel is going to unpack some of these concerns. Is going to speak from some experiences of being involved in some multi-stakeholder structures, and also a sort of a little bit of an alert of what we need to be looking for and thinking about as we engage. This isn't meant to be a comparison between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. It is really taking a look at how do we address the challenges we face from an accountability of all powerful actors, an accountability approach here. We have 4 panelists, 4 presenters that are going to explore in different ways this topic. And so in terms of the actual presentations, we have Debbie Stothard, who is with ESRnet and involved with the steering committee on the analysis of corporate capture from their work, a task force. We have Emilia Reyes. Emilia is with, in this context, speaking from the point of view of the campaign of campaigns. We have Kai Yiping, who is with Dawn. And we have Chi Yok Ling, who is with TWN and very active at the moment as well with Dawn in the Feminists for a People's Vaccine. Each of them are aware that they don't have very much time to talk about what is clearly a very, very demanding. I think a lot of us could talk about this topic for quite a long time. So I'm going to ask for permission in advance. Well, I'm actually not telling the truth. I'm not going to ask for permission. Sorry, team. If we go beyond a certain time frame, I'm more than likely going to politely say 1 more minute or 30 seconds or something equally difficult. And as I've said before, there is, I hope, a very active chat session. And please, we will bring your questions to the panelists, to the presenters, and maybe even have some conversations that we can do amongst each other in the very short time we have before us this morning. The other thing I'd like to quickly mention about the chat is, because we have very little time, also use it to put additional resources, information. You will find the information with regard to Twitter handles or Twitter and organizational information. This is meant to be the beginning of and the continuation of a very important discussion. Thank you all for joining us. And I would like to turn straight away to Debbie.
Thank you, Barbara, and hello, everybody, and thanks for having me. Before I launch into corporate capture, there's a 2-minute video that would probably portray my concerns much more powerfully. So can we start with that video? Thanks.
La serie aborda la captura corporativa como un fenómeno de acaparamiento social, político y cultural que tiene efectos devastadores en la vida de las personas y los pueblos.
This comic series is about the problem of corporate capture, where global corporations, wealthy elite, the 1% as we call them, capture our governments, pervert our democratic institutions, so that they can make sure that government works in their favor rather than in the public interest.
En diferentes episodios de la serie de historietas se visibilizará lo que está ocurriendo con la cultura corporativa.
It will also shed light on how corporate capture plays out at the United Nations, how corporate capture exacerbates situations of conflict and violence.
Solo un 1% de la población mundial, la élite económica, acumula gran mayoría de la riqueza de los recursos.
This comic series, it names the problem of corporate capture, and it's a tool for us as global social movements to find a common language for a problem that affects all of us. Our message is clear.
No podemos ser incautos, así que ayúdanos a difundir y a defendernos de este virus corporativo.
Thank you. So there's an entire series of comics that have been produced and will be continue to be produced looking at corporate capture. Sorry. At corporate capture, where all of us, the 99%, collectively try to overturn and try to expose the imbalance, the gross imbalance of power and wealth that corporations enjoy. And so as feminists, one of the things that has been quite concerning is that even in a democratic situation, women still suffer from barriers to participation, and more importantly, barriers to leadership. And when we're talking about multilateral spaces, what's becoming quite concerning is that corporate capture is becoming so visible in the multilateral system, in the United Nations system. One very clear example is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the Conference of Parties, the COP, with big polluters putting using billions of dollars to lobby for agreements that best suit their financial interests, where big polluters are actually bankrolling UN events. Another stark example is the capture of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which had plans to renew and strengthen its alliance with CropLife International, a trade association for the pesticide and biotech industry, and to even explore new partnerships with that industry. So we can already see some very severe conflicts of interest that will result in more violations of a range of human rights, including the right to livelihood security for very vulnerable communities and communities in which women would be disproportionately affected. I've been working with ESCRnet as part of a global movement to engage in the drafting of a treaty on transnational cooperation and their behavior. And this is a process that started in 2014, and every year we've been converging on Geneva and engaging with states and other stakeholders to ensure that this treaty has at its heart the fundamental right to protection of rights, but also the fundamental right for accountability for affected communities to access remedy. What has been very concerning is the fact that the International Chamber of Commerce and the International Organization of Employers have continued in so many ways to block the treaty process. They have the IOE and the ICC have strong ties to abusive industries. So they've been continually finding ways and means and even almost threatening poorer countries, economies in the South, that they will lose investments if those states supported the treaty process. So I think if we look at that, then I mean, you can talk about corporate capture, and even what's happening at the UNGA at the moment, but we also need to think about the Finance in Common Summit, which happens next month, where all the over 200 public development banks are having a summit, and the entire agenda is oriented towards, although it's supposed to be about food security, it's oriented towards the agenda of the food industry, the food and agriculture industry. So one of the things that we need to do as feminists is to expose this and to inform ourselves what corporate capture looks like. So there's actually a link in the chat box about a one-pager that helps you understand the manifestations of corporate capture. And when you read it, you're going to go, oh, damn, that's been happening in my community. Oh, damn, that's happening right now in my country. And oh, OMG, this is happening at the UN. And we actually have to expose it and resist it, because as feminists who actually need an effective, transparent, and accessible multilateral system, it is in our interest to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And, thank you for your examples immediately of so many different ways in which all hands on deck means that what can I say? We use all of these slogans, the uneven playing field and all the rest of it. Not only continues to be uneven, but with all of this, we're getting very much of a tipping in the wrong direction. You highlighted as well the work that's taking place around the working group of the Human Rights Council with regard to the binding treaty, which is an attempt in the human rights context to really address these issues. Before turning quickly to Emilia on this, one of the things I suppose I want us to think about as we go through this conversation is why or how we should be engaging the UN agencies themselves in terms of why they are getting involved, in why they are either feeling the pressures or whether they see this as a solution to the problems that they're involved in. And I'm going to ask Emilia in whatever remarks she has, because I shouldn't really tell her what she's going to say, and I'm not going to do that, Emilia. But I also know that you were very much involved in the experience around Beijing +25 and with the Generation Equality Forum and the action coalitions, which were actually heralded as a multi-stakeholder approach. And I think it would be very helpful to hear a little bit as well of the concrete experience of how feminists are having to work with these dynamics and how you confronted it. Emilia.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be among friends and learning so much as you are all working on these issues, because at this point super concerned about the status of the world as it is now. And I don't think we're making any indentation in the official places. Therefore, it's very rewarding and inspiring to see that people all over the world is keep on at this struggle that is of life and death at this moment. So yeah, I wanted to say that, you know, I have this background in my Zoom permanently. I keep on insisting on it on every occasion I get, because this is the background showing the differentiation between the monetized value that is generated by women on their unpaid domestic and care work. All of this yellow dimension is non-monetized value, meaning there is no, not only there is no payment, there is not enough money in the world to pay for this, because this is where money exists. This is money. This is not money, because there is not enough money in the world. And yet women are producing all of this value. This here is the amount of value produced by voluntary work. Here you will find a lot of community work. You will find many men working on this, but of course women are also working at the community level and doing voluntary work. But you can see the dimension, and this is why we say that women are subsidizing the entire economy. So I don't have time to explain more of this, but this is enough to say that women's human rights should be placed at the center of the paradigm shift in all of the spheres. We are emphasizing here as well the relation to holding the health of the planet and biodiversity. So women are also upholding that. So when we see the interrelation of all of the crises, like the economic ones, the environmental ones, the social ones, we see that women's rights should be placed at the forefront of the agenda. And I say this, I also want to remind you how much we lost with the SDGs. We have lost already with the MDGs. We had come from the decade of the 90s with all of the human rights instruments. And then with the MDGs, we lost all of that framework. And in 2012, 13, the feminist movement came back to engage with the post-2015 agenda because we wanted to bring back the human rights agenda. And we lost. We all know that we lost. The actors who lost the most were women. Why? Because you know that Goal 5 has, it used to have in the previous drafts an acknowledgement of women's human rights. And then because of conservative countries, we only have language on gender equality and women's empowerment. And as a result of that, UN Women itself changed its own mandate and now is focusing only on gender equality and women's empowerment, dismissing at all the mandate on women's human rights. And you know, this has been an ongoing process also because the term women's empowerment is more pleasing to conservative and fundamentalist actors who started to be donors of UN Women. And this is very much pertaining to these questions, because it's not only member states, but remember all of the flirting of UN Women with Coca-Cola and many other corporate actors who really couldn't engage with a demand that as structural as women's human rights, and therefore moves to empowerment. And I just want to say how we lost the dimension of women's human rights, because now in Beijing Plus 25, when we should be following that inheritance of the mandates of Beijing, now literally the mandate is on gender equality and women's empowerment. So that is one element that I really want to emphasize. Second is that, of course, we have this multi-stakeholder partnership, and therefore in the Economic Justice and Rights Action Agenda, we have nonetheless and none the more the Gates Foundation sitting at the table and PayPal, alongside the OECD in our table. So when we're dealing with these issues of the agenda, everybody was super happy to talk about gender responsive budgeting and of course access to resources, and even lending, access to bank accounts and credit cards, and how they would have access to resources. But you know, of course, resources seen as more small lending and microcredits. So the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development jumped in, and we are co-leads, and we wanted to have a blueprint that is an agenda that is not only focusing, we have others, we have one of care, which is great because it's totally addressing this issue that I was emphasizing, but also we were talking about the macroeconomic and global economic and financial dynamics. And this is the only blueprint of the entire action coalitions that hasn't been approved, because we have met with resistances from the corporate actors, from the philanthropic actors, from the member states, and even from some UN agents that are seated in our table, because they say that this doesn't have anything to do with women's empowerment. One actor even said, no, but this is what our role is, to bring access for women to money. And it's like, no, this is not our mandate. So at the time we have these blueprints stopped, we are going back to a negotiating table, even though it doesn't seem like this is a negotiating table, when all of the actors have placed red flags in our demands of an agenda that is calling for a global tax body, debt cancellation, a TRIPS waiver at the WTO, etc. All of our global demands, all of them are met with a red flag from all of these actors. And beyond that, I really want to say how concerned I am, especially about the Gates Foundation. I think at the moment, when we have this vaccine inequality, people is saying, oh, well, all of these millions were committed in the forums in Paris and Mexico. And however, there is not a single demand on checking on the portfolios of the actors who are making a commitment. So why aren't we demanding of the Gates Foundations, of PayPal, etc., to check on their portfolios and really mainstream women's human rights to their mandates, rather than making commitments on whatever it is that they want to make? And of course, this is something that is really concerning to me, because most feminists are asking, what is the transparency for those funds that have been committed and supposedly will be allocated soon? They wanted for that money for the women's movement, whatever. But I'm like, where is the schizophrenic mind? Yeah. Why aren't we asking the Gates to leave, or to really ask for their role in the vaccine justice? I'm gonna stop here, and hopefully I'll get some time to come back to this later.
I really hesitate to do that, because you are so knowledgeable and so passionate, and we really need these experiences. You've immediately strengthened our attention to the tension between a rights approach and we're all in it together, without any kind of due diligence, conflict of interest, various things as to who we all are in that particular context. I'm going to sort of add to the alerts that yourself and Debbie have already brought before us. Just to mention that in the Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda, that has just been released, and which is the major subject of attention, I think we need to also take a closer look at what the suggestion is there for the gateway, the interface, the pathway, the whatever, to strengthen civil society engagement with the UN. Because at the institutional level, this is being handed, as it were, to something called a UN Office of Partnerships. So immediately we're talking about that kind of an approach, rather than the right to participate, which we have through consultative status. For example, we have to make sure that this isn't being overshadowed or pushed aside or not recognized, number one. And number two, the office that has been given this responsibility basically is the office that is the counterpart from the UN side to the UN Foundation. So it's almost as if it's sort of giving the facilitating role to a US foundation accountable only to its board of directors. So I think as we go forward, it is yet another example of what we've already been hearing about. Yiping, I'm going to turn to you. Yiping, it'll be let's hear more perhaps about some of the tension with regard to human rights, or what we can do with regard to the human rights approach, what the implications are in work in the Global South or at national and regional levels. And one of the things that I thought of when Emilia was talking was this whole thing about inclusion, the emphasis on inclusion. And here she gave an example of what we don't mean by financial inclusion is to get into debt with a credit card, for example. And I remember Dawn frequently saying, we do not want to be integrated into a poison stream. So I'm not sure whether you appreciate my introduction of you, but Yiping, over to you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I do appreciate your introduction. Dear colleagues and friends, I think the committee member of Dawn, it's my great pleasure to be part of this event and contribute to this important and timely discussion on multi-stakeholderism from global South and feminist perspective and experience. I would like to acknowledge and appreciate the valuable knowledge and analysis has already been created extensively on this subject by Barbara, by fellow panelists of these events, and others who are concerned about this subject. For example, I just read the latest analysis done by Food Systems for People, the report titled Exposing Corporate Capture of UN Food Systems Summit Through Multi-stakeholderism. This report clearly shows that the private sector actors are the most influential in multi-stakeholder initiatives and their increasing influence over the governance of food systems. So why the multi-stakeholderism is problematic? We have observed the trends of the global governance gearing towards the multi-stakeholderism from multilateralism. Multilateralism is governance process and decision-making led by states, and multi-stakeholderism is, and by definition, is the practice of governance that brings multiple stakeholders, including the corporations, the corporate platforms, the business associations, donors, academics, the civil societies like us, the actors. So all together to participate in the dialogue, decision-making, and implementation of the response to joint perceived problems and multiple crises we're facing, from the public health, food security, to social injustice and inequality, to climate change. So it seems like, it sounds like it's more inclusive, collaborative, and partnership was emphasized, and therefore is seemingly more progressive and democratic. It sounds like elixir that can cure all the diseases, but it is like to drink poison to quench thirst, as one old Chinese saying suggests. Because this system and practice allows corporate sectors, especially most powerful transnational corporations and their platforms and associations, to direct international and national policy making, financing, narratives, and governance, while promoting corporate-friendly thought solution to the world crisis. So first of all, I do want to reiterate what Barbara has mentioned at the beginning of this events, that the current multilateralism is not function. It itself has faced many challenges and difficulties, and obviously in crisis. But it's not this problem introduce the well-being and findings from the PPP analysis conducted by Dawn and its partner. It shows how the privatization
Yiping, can I interrupt just 1 minute?
Public institution itself in so to address the issue of the financial. Yes, sorry.
No, I just wanted to check with others whether or not there is an audio problem.
There is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, why can you try it a little bit longer without the video and see if that helps? And if not, what I might do is come to Yockling and then come back to you afterwards to see whether.
Right.
But try without the video.
I just turned off the video. I hope that will improve the connectivity.
Okay, keep going. Sounds good at the moment.
All right. So the PPP analysis shows how the privatization had a particular negative effect on women, on community, and on the public institution itself in the economic south. So the 10 cases that are collected from the global south show that in the model of the PPPs, public needs and public policies are made into the business opportunities, which creates the wrong set of incentives. In India, for example, with the implementation of the PPP model in the National Health Insurance Scheme, invasive surgeries with significant consequences are being carried out among racialized and indigenous women without proper consent, even in the circumstances where those surgeries are not medically necessary. In one of the Zimbabwe's major hospitals, women who could not access fee-paying services were left to wait at the expenses of their health and survival, and this is the main factor that contribute to the maternal and infant mortality. Overall, the PPPs are conducting in the very opaque practice and reduce the accountability. And women workers and women's organizations are at the front line to fight against this, and requesting the transparency. So overall, I think the PPPs from that research are backed with public money, which means that all financial risks are backed with public money. In another case, in Senegal's major highways was referred as the most expensive in the world because it cost 5 to 6 times as the amount of similar projects in Morocco and Tunisia. So that shows that in this case and many other similar cases, this closes the popular myth about the PPPs, which always say the PPP is more cost efficient. And another areas of concern, the transition from the multilateralism to multi-stakeholderism is in the digital sectors. The Dawn, in partnership with IT for Change, has conducted some analysis on this subject. So in this, currently, I think that some UN, working group has been set up dealing with digital governance or big data has included, very powerful, the big companies, the internet company like Google was in the working group on the big data, and the Chinese companies. They had the CEOs of Chinese, the Baidu was also sitting in the very important major UN, the working group. So I think with this, we see the growing trends of the corporate hijack of global governance structure in many different areas, in the food, in gender equality, in the digital governance. So this is this mechanism. We haven't seen any really proper accountability mechanism has been set up, and there's the corporate capture has impacted, has very clear, the one of the characteristic of this transition. So this is the big concern of the civil society, and the feminist voice is definitely critical in the efforts to construct the accountability mechanism. In regards of the digital sectors, the corporate sector in some instances has hold much more power than the states themselves, and the privilege and much weight. Yes.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
Yes, I will wrap up in 1 minute, in less than 1 minute. So they have actually hold much more power and has much more weight in the negotiation on the digital governance, not only in the terms of extractive and exploitative capture and using data without any respect of human rights. But more concerning is that they're dominant and monopolize and manipulate, for the financialization. We see the big fintech. But I think there's also some, some government has now showed a big concern on this.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I will stop here. Thank you, Barbara, for your patience.
Thank you. And sorry that I was insistent. I do have one eye on the clock here for everybody as well. And I think there are some good questions in the chat, and certainly wanting more information, Yiping, and sources with regard to the research here. And so I'm going to encourage you and others to post as much as possible in the chat with regard to that. There's also a good question from Geeta about to what extent this is a continuation of what we've been witnessing and to what extent it's different and more intensive. So I think the one comment I'd like to make on all of that is it's in the business model now. Before we were talking about corporate social responsibility. Now it's been integrated in a way in the business model. And the major concern I would like to add is it's become part of the business model of the public sector, as Yiping was talking about the ideas around public-private partnerships, and increasingly the business model of the UN. And that I think is part of. So on the one hand, we've got a corporate capture, but I think we need to ask the question as to whether these are willing captives. Yokling, tell us about what's happening on COVID, on you and Dawn working together for a people's vaccine, on application of a lot of what we've been talking about right now to this really current devastating situation.
Thank you very much, Barbara. All that in 5 minutes. Well, I think let me
interrupt very quickly. It's very clear to me we can't do this in 1 hour. So I'm immediately going to say that there's going to have to be a follow-up. I don't know yet how we're going to plan it, but let me just say that this is at the minimum part 1. Okay,
it's a teaser, yes. Well,
yes.
What the pandemic has clearly thrown up, is not something that is a surprise. The disproportionate access of women to healthcare is not new. We've seen it in other, major infectious disease outbreaks and in day-to-day health needs. So what we've seen, though, is that the lack of a feminist perspective on access to medicines and to healthcare generally means that in this pandemic, women, are being devastated and do not feature in government lockdown decisions, in vaccine rollout, in equity at the level of our community and our nations. So when we talk about the inequities in terms of the hoarding by the wealthy countries and the monopolies of the corporations in the pharmaceutical sector, when we bring it down to the level of access, the inequities go very, very deep when it comes to women in every country, and more so in the South. So what we have seen is that also because of the lack of the women's movements in engaging in access to medicines and treatment, I'm not saying there are many feminists who've been very active, but as a whole, the feminist movement had not been so involved in taking on, access to medicines, and in that respect, intellectual property rights as a major, major obstacle in creating the monopolies. So what has happened, therefore, was that when the pandemic broke out, we did not have a concerted response from the women's movement, but that discrimination and inequities that women have to bear is just devastating. And we're not talking just about women, we're talking about, and this is where, coming together, we look at in terms of where you're located within the country, in the rural areas, if you have disabilities, and gender discrimination is deep into that, and discrimination across so many factors are actually driving this inequity. So what has happened really is that the power of women's rights movements to organize and advocate can be phenomenal. And we know that we've seen that in the face of all kinds of resistance and obstacles, women's groups and coalitions in the movements. And for us in the South, the structural inequities are so deep from the global to the local. So we believe that energy, that perseverance under the most difficult times exists. And that is why when Dawn approached TWN, and we've been talking for a long time, Geeta, who's here, and myself, how can we bring together the work that we do in terms of bringing together the structural analysis, the work of advocacy at the global level, and how do we bring that, and how do we bring it together and help to shape a feminist perspective from the global south with our partners in the north. And the trigger for coming together is therefore the formation of the Feminists for People's Vaccine. It's a campaign, it's an initiative, but it's much more than that. Although it's called the Feminists for People's Vaccine, because of the capturing of the imagination of the people around the world, that we need a public goods approach for the vaccine, was what really stimulated our campaign. But we are talking about affordable, equitable COVID-19 vaccines access, drugs, medicines for treatment. We're talking about equipment, we're talking about testing, we're talking about the whole gamut of what you need to actually respond from a public health point of view to the disease. And so this is really about access to medicines and not just about vaccines. And we really want to bring together the unique perspective of feminists from the global south and our partners, so that we can inject it into the debate around policy responses into public health. We talk about PPPs and how far it has gone in really violating human rights and even co-opting the state. And this is where we see the countries and the regions within countries in this pandemic that has best been able to respond have been where there are public health systems still intact, still resilient, and still functioning. And where we see more privatization, PPPs, it's been absolutely disastrous. And so for us, this movement, this campaign of the Feminists for People's Vaccine is about really bringing the imbalance of power and bringing the power that does exist in women's movements, and to bring that forth so that we do not talk about, as if we're all equal around the table. We are not multi-stakeholders here. We are not even your partner. We are partners among ourselves. We have to build solidarity among the movements, and we have to confront where the other side is a problem. And why, in the midst of all this, are we focusing on the TRIPS agreement? Now, the TRIPS agreement, the WTO, really personifies probably the worst in terms of what we talk about. Because if you think about it, the TRIPS agreement came into life basically in 1995. It would not have existed if the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry, and we heard earlier on about the food industry and agriculture and that total capture by industry. Now, if it had not been for the pharmaceutical and biotechnology and agro-business industries in the 1980s, if they had not pushed so aggressively for it, we would not have the TRIPS agreement today. The irony is that the CEO of Pfizer at that time was the fervent leader of bringing the battle for intellectual property monopolies through the United States into the global arena. And today, Pfizer is leading the pack in putting profits and its stronghold on vaccine market before lives. So for those of us who have worked for a long time to expose the callousness and the greed of pharma, we are still stunned at the current behavior in this COVID pandemic. It is really, really unbelievable. But WTO, for all its problems, because some nation states, some states from the South, had actually managed to keep some degree of flexibility and room to maneuver. And it is our responsibility to engage and to really recapture the state for public goods, for public health, and to make sure that whatever room we have in the system, in this case, the TRIPS agreement, has to be pushed wide open. And the waiver, and it's only temporary, it's only 3 years as a compromise already, right? But at least 3 years. We're not saying we'll stop in 3 years. If this pandemic needs us to really go beyond 3 years, there is that room in the text. And there are many agreements with this flexibility of waivers as well. So this waiver is very necessary because it is a tool to push back on the pharmaceutical monopolies and to open up production and to public goods. And so taking the waiver on is very much a part of the struggle of women's movements everywhere, because every day feminists fight for human rights, for equality and justice. And that is part of the fight. So we are very excited. We have 21 partners, coalitions from across the South and the North. And the response has been tremendous. And we are doing research, workshops, advocacy, and we will change what partnership means, and we will have to really battle really about the imbalance of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And for those who haven't visited the Feminists for People's Vaccine website, I really encourage you to. There's so much material there, and some of it is really quite entertaining. So we've heard so much about so many different issues. right? So we are not talking about a particular issue at the moment. We're basically talking about the whole process of governance. We're looking at the impact of decision-making. And I think what we've been doing is showing examples of the ways in which the decision-making process, which has helped or which has contributed to the actual crises that we've been building up and facing over the last few decades, particularly cross-border, are basically still in the hands of the same kinds of approaches that created them in terms of who is supposed to solve them. And there's a very strong emphasis here also on market solutions approach. And what it really is doing is putting the burden, frankly, of change through market measures on individual consumers, many of whom themselves are basically victims of precarity of labor and so on and so forth. So I warned you at the beginning that this session was really going to be an alert, that was really going to identify what should be a very controversial topic, which in fact is not being approached with controversy, but which is being approached as the way forward. And as you can see in the chat as well, a reference to now and an emphasis on networked and inclusive multilateralism, which I think we're trying to even figure out what it means. There have been in the chat some very valuable links and resources for further exploration. There are also a number of questions which in about the 5 minutes that we have left, I would be misleading you if I thought we could do justice to. What I'm going to propose to do is to give each of our presenters the impossible one sentence that they would like to basically offer at this stage on not so much a takeaway from this conversation, but really what they regard as key issues for us all to work together on going forward. We've already heard some of that. So who shall I start with? Emilia, one sentence.
That's so cruel. I would just say that the UN is prioritizing fundraising over policy implementation, and also in particular with the GEF, the Generation Equality Forum, they're prioritizing branding over policy.
Yes, nice. 2 sentences, good ones. Debbie?
We are all here as kick-ass feminists who have the energy and the brains and the expertise to change this around. And this is why we're here. So we got to keep on meeting, we got to keep on working, and we got to keep on pushing forward.
Jocelyn?
I would say that one of the biggest private-public partnership we have to really push back and get out of the way is in the health arena. We have to recapture our public health systems and make that part of our heritage.
Yiping?
I think it's important to really to rethink about what this multilateralism means, because there's no old clear definition for us to go back. So I think that's the process to create this new meaning, the meaning that includes the feminists, includes the people's, everyone, and not the profit first, but people first. That's what my sentence.
Thank you, everyone. I think that the challenge is a little bit like you've all said. We can't go back to how it was before. It didn't work for feminists. We didn't feel included. We became very active and skillful in working with that structure. It was universal. It was clear where the opening spaces were, even though they were very difficult to access. We're now facing something that is quite different. We're facing a kind of self-selected voluntary governance. And it's a real tension in terms of our work. If we choose not to be involved in it because we don't believe in it, because it isn't based on human rights, because it isn't universal, because there aren't rights of participation, we fear it carries on without us. But we really haven't built yet what we need to work together and support each other in terms of figuring out how we do engage it. But I think what you've heard this morning, afternoon, evening, or middle of the night is some really, really fine analysis, support, and also sort of understanding, not so much toes in the door, not so much involved in that kind of way, but certainly not just turning the other way, so to speak. And I really look forward to the women's major group and everybody who's participating here help us to work together to figure out and strengthen the strategies. We have the analysis, we have the commitment, we have the passion. We really need to start thinking out how to strengthen and how to engage and support each other in strategies that need to be addressed going forward. I thank everybody here. I thank all of the people that you didn't see that helped to make this happen. I'm sort of feeling really bad that I couldn't pull out more of what's in the chat because there's a lot involved in the chat. It will be recorded and available. There are some also very valuable resources and analyses that have been posted there from all of the organizations. And I'm giving us all some more work. I look forward to us meeting again, I hope quite soon. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for organizing. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Barbara. I think there is a need for more specific subjects for each session because there are a lot complicated and interacted. So hopefully, let's say take a subject like gender parity, which is claimed by the UN. Can we address that and and how is it reflected? How is it going on?
Yes, I think what you're raising is I think what Jokling said a little bit earlier, even though we didn't plan it like it, I think it has become a teaser. And it's not just a teaser for us, it's a teaser for all of us, including you.
Yeah.
So we're not only are you going to be able to make suggestions of what we're going to do, we're going to make suggestions of what you're going to do as well. So, okay. And I look forward to this happening together. Thank you.